Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Zero Hour Getting to the Roots of the Climate Crisis Immigration Week, our panel with these wonderful activists and organizers. We're going to get started now with our introductions. We're just going to have name, pronouns, organization, or work that we do, and how our morning has been. So I can go first. My name is Claire Hedberg. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work with Zero Hour as an organizer and specifically for this Immigration Week. And I'm on Powhatan land here in what is now known as Virginia, and was born on Guatemala on Mayan land. And yeah, my morning has been pretty good. I'll pass it to Catherine.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be in community with you all. My name is Catherine. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a Yaqui O'odham woman. I am currently residing in Luiseno territory, which is the Lake Elsinore area, but a lot of my work with Affirm Los Angeles is done in Tongva territory. Affirm Los Angeles is a transnational feminist org that is anti-imperialist. We believe that the woman's place is at the head of the struggle, and so we just fight for any sort of oppression that struggles. So whether it is immigration issues, sex trafficking, sacred sites, we are there at the head of the struggle and just doing what we can to stand in solidarity with other women across the nation, across the world, doing what we can. So great to be here. Thank you for having me. And I will popcorn to Karen.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here with y'all. My name's Karen. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I am in what is formerly known as Seminole Land, which is Orlando. Currently, I'm not as familiar with land acknowledgements, but I want to make sure that I, mention that. I currently am the lead digital organizer of a team with Florida Immigrant Coalition, BOATS, and so I primarily do electoral work with them right now, and what makes our work really special is that we empower our community, and so we're not focused on a particular election. We're more so focused on how we can essentially mitigate the harm and violence and terrorism that is going towards our immigrant community, and that includes, Black trans immigrants, that includes queer immigrants, that includes, Latinx immigrants, that includes so many different people, and so I'm really excited to be in this space, but also to be doing the work that I'm doing today. I'm doing well. I'm a little tired, but overall excited to be here, and I'll pass it over to Tristan.
Hi everyone, I'm happy to be here this morning. My name is Tristan and my pronouns are she, her. So I am currently the founder of Youth for Border Aid. I founded this organization about a year ago, and I'll be attending Stanford as a freshman this upcoming fall. So what we do as an organization is really try to empower our community. I currently live in San Diego, which is right on the border of Tijuana. So we try to provide physical aid for our sisters and brothers across the border. And then also we really focus on educating the youth population more about the history of immigration and try and be more inclusive about the way that we speak about immigrants and what they're currently going through in America. So I'll popcorn to Alan.
Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today. My name is Alan. I am an independent artist currently based in Chochenyo Ohlone land, also known as Oakland, California. I am Zapotec. I was born and raised in Mixtec and Zapotec territory, and I work on the fields of public narrative, primarily how social movements tell their stories to reflect their lived experiences and decenter empire and settlement. And yeah, thank you. I'm doing well. I use they and them pronouns, and I'll send it over to Tanu.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me and glad to be in this company. My name is Tanu. I use she and her pronouns. I am a Sri Lankan immigrant to the US. I grew up in Sri Lanka and I came to the US when I was 18. I previously worked in the immigrant rights movement in New York and I now work in the climate justice movement. I'm the communications director at 350.org. And a lot of my interests sort of sit in the intersection of migrant, racial, economic, and climate justice. And I entered the climate movement really with a desire to push more migrant stories and narratives because oftentimes the climate crisis and the impacts on the most impacted people who are Black, Indigenous, migrants, and people of color are left out. And so I've been really trying to like seed that narrative into the climate movement. And I'm doing okay. It's up and down sometimes.
Awesome. Okay, so the panel is going to work. I just have general questions for you that everyone can answer, and some questions for specific people. And then if we have any questions for each other, or we just want to make the discussion organic, we can do that. And I guess if you have a direct point, you can put the little asterisk in the chat so we don't like get mixed up, or I can address you personally, or you can popcorn it the answer to someone else. I just want to introduce this series, which is Getting to the Roots of the Climate Crisis Digital. We started this after the COVID pandemic started, just as a way to reach more people every day. So I'll start with the first question. Anyone can answer. Experiences with being an immigrant / immigrant activism, adversaries and motivations. Whoever wants to start can.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question is around?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, how have your experiences, like have you experienced immigration? How has your experiences created like your work in the space of immigrant activism? Like what is the work you do and how do your experiences play into that?
Sure, I can start. I am an immigrant. I came to the U.S. when I was 18. One thing I will say is that, I came to the U.S. for college, and um, one of the things that really struck me upon coming to the U.S. was just like this distinct, like I came as an international student. I had a scholarship to come here, and like so many folks in my communities, like in the US, like who had come at the age of 2 3 or whatever, didn't have those same opportunities. And like that's one of the things that I was super struck with, especially because like I went to a university where there were folks of mixed statuses. And at the time, because like in the earlier 2000s, people weren't necessarily identifying as dreamers, or and DACA wasn't around, like there was so much more like silence around those experiences. And I think for someone who, had the privileges of coming to the US on a scholarship, um, you know, was on visas, like I feel really committed to just a broader solidarity between immigrants of different statuses, because so much of the time we're pitted against each other. And more recently, with the like Trump's order, or DHS's order around international students having to go home if they weren't in a school that was having like real life classes during a pandemic, started this like whole flurry about like international students being able to stay. And like as an international student, I was like, y'all, like if you're going to be doing advocacy around international students, you better be like supporting undocumented communities and like other communities. And so like also doing like a lot of political education with folks I know who did come as international students. And I did have a really hard time staying in the US, but I think I've been very careful to like not center that experience, because like a lot of us struggle to stay in the US, and like actually the way to liberation is actually to stand in solidarity with each other and not create these ideas of like who is more deserving to be here. Um, and that's one of the reasons why I'm like really committed to the immigrant rights movement and have been doing this work for almost a decade. I'll pass it to Alan.
Thank you. Um, I think that the work that I do with public narrative has changed a lot in the last couple of years, actually. Um, Part of my work with public narrative was to decenter citizenship as an ask, because when we center citizenship as an ask, we erase indigenous communities in what is now considered the connected 48 states. Indigenous communities got citizenship in 1924, not even 100 years ago in the states. So for as an immigrant from an indigenous community, to ask for citizenship here seemed counterproductive to my own survival as a Zapotec person from Mesoamerica. And for me, it's been like, as a Black person, citizenship is not going to protect me. So how can, as a social movement, in immigration, we actually center critical care for one another. And recently, there's a lot of natural disasters in the land that I come from. So I had never contextualized my migration as a climate refugee or an environmental migrant. And in our current moment, I tell people that I am a climate refugee. I strictly like I very much remember in my early childhood the first time that a natural disaster pretty much undid my entire village. I was pretty young, and then in 2010 there was another natural disaster where my grandmother lost her home. 3 years ago, there was a natural disaster where my grandmother and my aunts lost their home again. And 2 months ago, there was a natural disaster that put almost the entire state that I migrated from in a state of emergency. So right now, I am considering myself an environmental migrant, which was something I did not consider when I was younger. And I think it's because I have a geographical understanding now of where I come from. So yeah, and Karin?
Yeah, I think y'all touched on a lot of really great, like, I guess, perspectives and just like places of being. And I guess I'm gonna just have a disclaimer saying that, you know, I have my limited perspective, right? And so that's kind of where I'll be talking from. I am a DACA recipient. I came to the United States, or what is known as the United States, at the age of 5. My dad actually walked across the border. He was detained a couple times. Once he was almost left to die without water. And my mother and I actually came across the border, and I think we were like in like a hidden compartment of like some kind of semi. And I don't remember much, honestly. Most of my earliest memories are of probably like kindergarten and first grade, which was about a year after I arrived, because I remember my mom kept telling me like she wanted me to enroll in school, but because I got here later than the start date, they had me wait another year, right? But from that perspective, right, here in Florida, where I have lived and have resided most of my time in this part of the continent, I have seen my community of all colors, right? Well, not immigrants of all backgrounds, be detained, arrested, deported, dehumanized, terrorized, and growing up in a predominantly white, I think we're like the third or fourth where I grew up, Naples, Florida, third or fourth like most like income inequality based town in the country, something like that. They're pretty high up there. I grew up with the perspective of a working class family, living in a society where we essentially provided for the billionaires and millionaires in my town. And so I come from a space where, again, my people were detained in a manner that, you know, we were one of the first counties across the country, Collier County, to directly work with ICE, and so our sheriffs and ICE had 287G and secured communities, which were agreements that established for the first time the information sharing between the more like federal government, which was right like CBP and ICE, right, and local sheriffs, right, which before wasn't shared. But I guess it's also important to point out that like a lot of these policies never existed. and I don't want to get too deep, but I'll just end with this. My perspective and why I do this work is because one, my uncle was detained and held in solitary confinement, but naked for 6 days, was detained for 13 months. I was the only person in my family, because of DACA, that could go visit my uncle. He was a clown. He worked in construction. He did children's parties as well as a clown. And I remember that the day he was to be sentenced to be deported back to Mexico, I had like an algebra test. It was like my freshman year of college. And I asked my professor if I could do makeup, and he said no. And so to this day, that's something that I regret, not being there for my uncle and not standing there in solidarity with him, because I don't believe that. That's another thing. I don't see myself as an immigrant. I see myself as a migrant. I feel like my people date back to living in this continent a lot longer than others, and I live in the society that is now what we call America, I guess. But for me, I have to acknowledge where I come from, and it's from this land. And so that's one short story of why I do this work. It's for my uncle. It's for my best friend Brenda, who in the 3rd grade told me on the school bus that we were going to hang out and watch High School Musical after school or something like that. We were going to watch a movie. And when my dad dropped me off at her house was empty and everyone was gone because they were terrorized that ICE was going to come. And a lot of my community disappeared growing up. And so for me, that's why I do this work. And so, yeah. And I'll pass it over to Catherine.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Karen, and thank you everybody who has shared their experiences so far. I come from a place of privilege where I'm not an immigrant, but when you spoke, Karen, about being of the land, that is my direct connection, that we have to have this confidence that we are of this land, that we existed in beautiful societies, beautiful communities, beautiful culture, beautiful establishments together before this infrastructure, before settler colonialism, before this imperialism took place. And as an educator, I'm a history teacher, and so I've taught many lessons on imperialism. And imperialism is this notion of, oh, well, it happened back in the 40s, the United States, did all of X, Y, Z, but we don't realize that it is happening still to this day, that we are direct results of that imperialistic society that the United States is. And to this day, those experiences of our families being on other sides of walls, not being connected, not being able to share our culture, our practices, our languages, all of those things. And so for me, I see this as I was raped of my culture. It was taken away. Like even my fair skin, that is not representative of who my people are, right? That is that constant reminder that I look at. But it's also a place of privilege and allows me to speak and be in areas and spaces that I can share these things. I can cross borders that other family members can't cross. I can go and do work and assist in ways that other people can't, and so that is why I'm connected to this fight. I'm connected because I can be here to help, to stand in solidarity, and again, not center my experience, because again, my experience comes from one of privilege, but to do what I can for others and to help and serve in that way, and to give us that confidence and that reminder that this is our land. You always hear that saying, that we didn't cross the border crossed us. The border was created, and right now we are still fighting to this day. As an O'odham woman, I am watching a wall being built in my traditional homelands, and the explosions and dynamite and water being contaminated so that they can pour cement, and they're going through national monuments, they're going through burial sites, they're going through all of those areas. Same thing in the Kumeyaay territories down in San Diego. Right now, a current camp there. And again, I am not speaking for these people, I'm speaking in solidarity with them, that, you know, these are two federally recognized tribes. What does that even mean at this point, to be federally recognized, but yet we're still going to come and enact eminent domain and tear up your lands and tear up a sacred site and tear up, and to create a border, to create a line? And again, I think other folks have talked about this so far in this circle, that the walls don't even exist on a physical plane. They also are building up walls amongst ourselves and each other, and the levels of how much of a immigrant, migrant, or person of color are you in this struggle and in this fight. And so the walls don't only exist in that physical level, but also on a community level, that we're losing that connection. And again, I just see it as a result of that settler colonialism tactic, that they come and invade us, and that they invade our minds, they invade our stances, they invade our communities from coming together in solidarity. So that's why I'm connected. I'm here, you know, to stand in solidarity and to do whatever I can to help brothers and sisters, because again, I don't believe in borders. I don't believe in those walls. My family's, you know, migrated from deep South Mexico all the ways up to Arizona, and, you know, here to California. You know, it was a cycle, it was a pattern. That's how we moved around. So that's why I'm here. And I will send that to Tristan.
Firstly, I just want to say I'm so amazed by all of your strength. It's just seriously, as a young woman, it is so important, I think, for people like me to see people like you. You guys are just so amazing. I have to say that first of all. And to give some background on myself, I am a third generation immigrant. My grandpa is Iranian. His family escaped religious persecution, which in part occurred because of US intervention there. So that's a whole other story. And I'm also a young Black woman, and these are both really important parts of my identity. And I'm sure as you guys have experience in your education, you really don't learn a lot about people who are not Eurocentric. There's just not enough education surrounding these issues. And I live in San Diego, California, where I live literally 15 minutes from the border. And somehow we're still so far removed from that population, from the people, from their stories. And I just feel like it was such a huge issue that we're right here and we know almost nothing about the detention center in our community. And it just seems so buried underneath years of historical trauma and oppression of people. So I really wanted to take that and educate other people my age, because in reality, we are going to be the future. We're the people who are going to be elected representatives. We're going to elect future representatives. And I really think we need more education surrounding this for the youth, because our schools simply don't do it. So thank you again for speaking out on all of these important issues, because it's what we need to hear so that we realize we are all one. We shouldn't be separated like this, and we can't let just capitalism and the patriarchy continue to separate us so much that we lose our identities as we trickle down generations. Even though I'm a third generation immigrant, I still want to remember my history. And I live in a community of second generation, third generation immigrants. And I think a lot of people have lost that part of their identity. So it's just so important to me that we continue to uplift and amplify these voices, because although I haven't experienced so many of the things that you guys have been through, I really think it's important to stand in solidarity and help uplift voices that need to be heard more.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you all for sharing your stories, for being vulnerable. I know that's really hard, especially these stories are emotional, and it's always hard to really bring yourself out and talk about that. My next question, I can say it out loud and I'm going to put it in the chat as well so you can reference it again, is how has COVID-19 affected immigrants, not only in the US, but in other countries? And how has this affected undocumented immigrants with ICE and the current conditions of detention facilities? Anyone can start.
I guess very quickly, I'm just going to start with, because a lot of the work that my organization does centers around the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is the one where near I live. So we've partnered with the organization Border Angels as well, which is where we get a lot of our information from. And I just want to mention that this is just one of many facilities, detention facilities for immigrants across the US, but the conditions are so poor and the neglect is so harsh that it's very clear that Core Civic, which owns the detention center, it's one of the biggest private prison owners in the US, and they make about $4 billion. That's their net worth. So these people who are in the detention centers are essentially just commodities to them. It seems the way that they treat them is really, it's a harsh business industrial complex rather than a place where people reside. So how that's impacted people during COVID-19 is that, first of all, they're not given the proper PPE in any way whatsoever, not even the staff. Staff sometimes have masks, but it's almost seems like it's been more of a choice for them to wear it. So if anyone's protected, it's first the staff, but immigrants aren't given any resources whatsoever to protect themselves. And this resulted in the death of one man already. So it's just very clearly a violation of human rights, of their rights being in the detention center, yet nothing has happened, even though there's been a coalition to sue Core Civic for this injustice. And on top of this, there's no social distancing in the facility. And now they're using really harsh and toxic chemicals to clean the facility, but this is also harshly impacting people's health because there's a lot of people with medical illnesses and who are more vulnerable to COVID-19. So the cleaning solutions only aggravate the problem. So obviously their lives are not being prioritized, cared for, thought of in the most simple ways. So there's a lot of injustice going on in detention centers all across the US right now.
Yeah, I would just add that, I live in New York, Lenape-Hoking territory, and, Black and brown people have been the most impacted by COVID here in New York and across the country. It's just disproportionately, it's Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color and immigrants who've been impacted. And to speak to New York specifically, it's folks who are working in service industries who don't really have a choice but to go to work, who don't have the privilege of working from home, and so they are most at risk of COVID, and that's been really detrimental to places in Brooklyn and places in Queens and the Bronx. And the one thing that's striking that it is for immigrants who, particularly who don't have status, who are undocumented, they haven't been getting any support federally from the government. So all of these like stimuluses that you hear about, like the CARES Act, etc., none of that supports undocumented immigrants. It doesn't support anyone who doesn't have status. And so there's just like, even in terms of like who is disproportionately impacted by COVID, which is like a large percentage of undocumented folks versus like the kinds of support that's like being provided by the federal government, that's not being there's a really lack of connection there. And I think like for me, what's really we've always known that capitalism was like hanging on by a thread. I think maybe some of us didn't think it would happen through a pandemic. I definitely was like a little bit stunned, but like this really shows what happens when like capitalism unravels, and who still are the workers working. It's mainly immigrants, it's undocumented folks, it's Black folks, and I think that that's something that's like really important to highlight, because when we talk about like recovering from COVID, like at 350 we've been using this term, a just recovery. We made really, really clear that when we talk about recovering from COVID and the climate crisis, like that has to be beyond borders. Like that has to be like with a framework of solidarity, because otherwise you're leaving large, like huge groups of people out.
I guess I could go next. Yeah, I guess where do I even start? I guess something that probably won't be mentioned by the other panelists that we face here in Florida is that obviously, yes, like undocumented people here, you know, are not getting, again, financial assistance of any form from the federal government. You know, obviously, like welfare is not accessible to them. But we're about to face hurricane season. And so, you know, if you can't afford to pay rent, you know, you're going to be evicted. If you can't afford to buy food, you're not going to have food. If you can't afford to pay the water bill, electricity bill, like you're not going to have those things. And we're seeing, you know, the potential of, yeah, like a merge between yeah, like the collapsing of our economic system, you know, climate disasters, and then on top of that, you know, how harsh and just, you know, not there for like all of the safety nets are for my people. And so I guess on a more like micro level, we see that a lot more undocumented families, you know, obviously they never had childcare, and now it's even harder to work and, you know, be, you know, potentially in danger, while at the same time trying to make sure that your children are taken care of. I know that in Seminole County, which is a little bit north of where I'm located in Orlando, there I met with the president of Seminole County Education Association, so like the teachers union, and he told me that if it that essentially his county, and he believes all of the state of Florida had and still has no actual plan for ESOL classes for students. So we have to look at the impact of what's going on, from a very, yeah, like intersectional like point of view, I would say. Intersection being all the oppression. But yeah, it's affecting, you know, not just like our communities right now, but it's going to be like something that's detrimental for even the next generation. And, you know, as someone who lives in a place where, you know, if you dig a hole, eventually it'll be filled with water because we're on sea level, right? We have the potential to be the next, you know, Hurricane Maria, like in Puerto Rico, right? Where people there still who are living without, you know, electricity and water and so on. And so I've kind of been all over the place, but I guess I just wanted to highlight some of the differences that I kind of see in my community, right? Along with just the overall lack of information, and prioritization from the main Latinx like TV stations about COVID. I feel like, you know, it's one thing, you know, obviously to be propaganda and to be, um, you know, not sharing, I guess, like what is most prevalent right now. But it's another thing to just disregard it and to just not bring it up at all. And so I was actually the one who had to sit my parents down and be like, Mira, like look, like you can't go out, like you can't do anything. And it got so bad that my dad actually like lied to my mom and like went out and like just like did something, right? Like I think he just went to the store or something, but didn't tell my mom. And I feel like there's just so much like information that is not being dispersed in the languages that people need. And that's not even like just Spanish, right? Like we're talking about indigenous languages. I know that the Mayan Guatemalan Center, here in West Palm Beach, which is like right above like Miami and Fort Lauderdale, they have I think like 3 or 4 different like dialects that people speak there. And so they they actually had to create their own COVID testing, right? The mayor was saying things like, oh, these people, you know, they're not, you know, like, well, actually our governor blamed Hispanic workers and immigrant workers for the rise in COVID here in our state. So that's where Florida's at. But the local mayor of West Palm Beach actually said, you know, we have all these resources and these people just don't come in. And it's not even that. Like the Mayan Guatemalan Center ran their own like survey and found that people were not attending because the COVID testing was during working hours. They had no evening testing. They had no weekend testing, right? And so I feel like, and I hate to like keep going, but I just find this really prevalent, right? And so they not only were able to set up their own testing site, but they were able to have people there interpreting in the language that people speak, right? To make sure that there's no miscommunication on any of the facts of how to prevent COVID and how to be able to stay safe, among all the other insecurities that they're facing, right? And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I just want to leave it at, just some things that I wanted to mention from Florida.
Yeah, I mean, everything that was already said. And I feel like what COVID did is COVID kind of put our whole nation and our societal structure into a petri dish. And it kind of just forced us to look at every single layer of what's going wrong, you know, because it made us pause, it made us stop, you know. Unfortunately, yes, immigration has been an issue for many years, many years. When I was in high school over 30 years ago, you know, it was, you know, the economic wealth distribution has been a problem. You know, the racism has been a problem. But what happened is that it forced us to pause and to stop and to have to look, you know. So all of these layers that have already been mentioned, definitely present in COVID. And so I just want to add one extra layer, just because I am an educator, is education as well. On my block, I have families here that are undocumented, and we literally have the school across the street from us, but they will not ask questions. They will not ask for extra resources. They will not, because of that fear, because of just, and also it's not accessible, it's not available to them. And so I think about that as an educator, how much, you know, again, I'm not one for measures and markers and benchmarks and all of those things, but just providing and the equality of education, you know. So again, that petri dish, all of these things are put into there that we're just witnessing that have already been broken down, have already been problems. But now COVID just put them all front and center for us. We can't turn away. So I see education definitely being affected for undocumented students at this time, who already had that layer of struggle of being undocumented and trying to receive a quality education. And then now, you know, whether you're in second grade or a 12th grader right now, you're not going to have those resources available to you to sit down with a college counselor and go over applications and how it's supposed to look, to figure out your financial aid, or to meet with all of those people that normally you have that access to. And now it's on the parents, and those parents don't want to reach out of fear. And so that's just one other addition, again, like as myself as an educator, that I see how, you know, this pandemic is affecting undocumented folks at this time.
Yeah, thank you all. Those were all like really insightful answers, and like definitely added like different perspectives to the conversation about this. I'm putting the next question in the chat, and I'll read it out loud as well. The connection between the abolish ICE movements and police abolition movements. Can you speak on your work regarding social and political uprising we're seeing for racial justice right now? And I know Alan wanted to start this question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that right now there's a lot of discourse on abolish ICE and police abolition, and a lot of people like to think about them as separate. And I want to clarify that they're not separate movements. Police abolition will by default abolish any policing practices, and abolish ICE is actually a little bit flawed in the sense that abolish ICE is not rooted in a Black and Indigenous framework. Police abolition is a Black and Indigenous framework. Police abolition started during the plantation state, where plantation owners commissioned people to go catch runaway people who were enslaved. And during the American Indian boarding schools, any children who ran away from the boarding schools were also, people were commissioned to go find the indigenous youth who had run away. And that's where police abolition comes from. It's about safety for all communities in settled territory, because policing as we know it is a settler tactic. And abolish ICE. It's attempting to create a framework where we need to do this so that all immigrants are safe. And somehow there's a little bit of pushback from abolish ICE organizers on police abolition, because abolish ICE depends on the narrative that immigrants are not criminals, which is by default anti-Black, anti-queer, anti-trans, because those communities have always already been criminalized. And abolish ICE also, I think, because of the precarity of documents, right, which like are life-changing in settler empires. If you have any type of documentation, whether it be a temporary work permit or a visa or a permanent residence card, your life will forever change and you'll have access to so much more. And I want us to kind of like remember that those things are super important because they change our immediate material condition. And also, whenever we are accepting these things, to always remember what the end goal is. The end goal is not to belong to this society. The end goal is to abolish the state and the tools that created that pinned us against each other. So I just want to clarify that like abolish ICE and police abolition should not be separate movements. And right now they are because of slight differences that can easily change, because all it requires is a larger imagination that doesn't depend on competition or frameworks of belonging. We have to like accept one another. If in order for police abolition to happen, in order for police abolition to happen and abolishing ICE to happen, we have to know how to protect one another as people outside of identities.
Yeah, super agree with everything Alan said. And also just want to add that there's like this real false dichotomy between like abolish ICE and abolish the police. And you know, so much of the abolish ICE movement, like actually if we think about like who's in detention and who's facing deportation, like there's also this idea that like somehow there's not Black migrants who are also facing that. And just to give you like some statistics, although only 7% of non-citizens in the US are Black, they make up 20% of those facing deportation on criminal grounds. Meaning that Black migrants are more criminalized. They're actually more likely to be put in solitary confinement in detention centers. And so there is this like real connection between like racial and migrant justice that a lot of the, you know, the non-Black, you know, migrant rights movement has really erased for a really, really long time. And like that needs to stop. The racism of the immigrant rights movement at large needs to stop, the anti-Blackness of the immigrant rights movement. And it's really amazing to see the work of, you know, folks like the Black LGBTQ plus Migrant Project, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, Undocu Black, who are all really bringing, you know, centering Black migrants in a lot of the narrative that they have, you know, been left out of, which is completely, I mean, it's just extremely racist because like the root of abolish ICE that no one ever talked about was abolition. Like the whole framework of abolition is, like Alan said, that comes from, you know, chattel slavery. It comes from like the whole idea of police in and of itself was about policing the Black body first and foremost, and there are extensions to that. But I think that we need to see these movements as connected, and I think it's particularly ironic for me, someone who actually worked for a pretty mainstream immigrant rights organization, to see people who like just do not have an analysis of like this movement for abolition and don't know really how to be in real solidarity with the movement for Black lives. And like we need to stop thinking of immigration issues as separate from Black issues and separate from Indigenous issues. They're actually like the same thing, and that actually requires that we do intense internal political education to ensure that those silos are no longer created, because ultimately it is a broader movement for abolition of the systems that do not serve us.
And I guess I'll add that the organization that I work for, I work on the C4 side, but the C3 side, which is Florida Immigrant Coalition, it was founded by Latinx folk here in, I believe, in the 90s, I think mid 90s, and so during this time of yeah, like a lot of abolish the police, I guess like Black Lives Matter movement, we've done a lot of like internal, like you were mentioning before, political education, where we have gotten, even though you would think it's through Zoom, but like very gone really deep into not just like what our role should be, but what exactly like we should be doing and how we should be centering our work. And so I'm not gonna say that we're 100% there, because I feel like no one really is, like, to like at least from like my org's kind of background, right? Like a lot of orgs similar to ours are not there. But I think that we've taken a lot of very important steps to really highlight a lot of important conversations, and it's particularly when it comes to anti-Blackness, when it comes into just how even when we're looking at candidates to endorse, right, like are we making sure that we're endorsing like Black, queer, immigrant folks that are running? Are we supporting the people in our community who haven't had their voices heard? And like it was mentioned before, like almost majority, if not half, like of all, like I believe it, sorry, Florida, there was just a video that came out where I really got to learn a lot about the folks who are detained right now, and a lot of them are Haitian. And so growing up in Florida, my community was primarily white, but my neighborhood, right, was the working class people. And so we had a lot of Haitian, Black, Guatemalan, Mexican people. And so one thing that a lot of people don't acknowledge also when thinking about folks who are detained, who are Haitian, is that they left because of earthquakes. They left because of different crises. And so I guess I just wanted to mention that too, because it's like it goes back to like all of this is like connected, right? And so I think it's like 75% of the world lives in an area that will be directly impacted by like sea level rising and different kinds of like climate change. But yeah, like obviously if we're not, if all of our work isn't centered around, Black liberation, is it really work? And so I guess that's just, my thoughts, and I'm not perfect either, so I'm working every day and learning. But thank y'all for highlighting so many important things.
I think just to add on to that a little bit, recently I've been a part of a student, youth-led, and also just Black women immigrant-led organization focused on defunding school police in San Diego. And I think it's really important to bring up that in schools, at least in my school district, 88% of law enforcement referrals are against Black and Latinx students. And in another district in San Diego, it is 75%. So we see that there's such a high criminalization of Black and Latinx students, which are also a lot of the population is immigrants as well. So I think that these issues definitely coincide, and that the criminalization of Black people and Latinx people from such a young age, it feeds right into the school to prison pipeline. but it also impacts our immigrant communities. In San Diego, we have a huge Somali immigrant community, and you see the direct criminalization of these students in our school districts. So it's important to bring up that, just like you guys said, Black immigrants are such a huge population that I think a lot of people overlook. There's also such a big issue with Latinx and just Mexican hegemony, I guess, in where the area where I live, a lot of Latinx immigrants are assumed to be Mexican. And it's important that we recognize that these groups need to be uplifted and thought of as one. And I really think that the youth is doing a really amazing job of seeing that from the start and working together and standing in solidarity. And we've been able to achieve so much more together than we would have if we were pitted against each other, which is what we see tends to happen. So I think that if anything, we are headed in the right direction. And it's really inspiring to see people like you guys act as role models for us when we do our abolition work as well.
Everything that everyone said, so on point. And I feel, as an Indigenous woman and as a member of a transnational org, I kind of walk in two realms. So as an org, what we do, and going back to Karen, like education, you know, getting those resources out there, educating folks, building community, have, like, you know, that's really where it's going to happen. And even as Tristan said, and I can attest to that, I mean, I'm fortunate, I get to develop my curriculum and I get to have my students read the Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States and read Howard Zinn and read Bukowski, you know, but it's not like that across the board. And so we have to have accessible education for others, to have these resources, to have panels like this, not just from experts, but from folks who are living the experience, who witnessed experience, and who are in solidarity with the experience. You know, it's valuable. And so that's what I do as an org, as a firm. That's what we do. We put out EDs, panels, and we educate community. But as a Native woman, and I also think about the healing. And that's where, you know, I feel that that's also the root of where we have to go. We have to heal. My grandfather, because his birth certificate says white, because you were only Black or white when you were born, not brown, not anything else in between, he says he is white, you know, and this man was born in Mexico, you know, he is not, you know. We have such intergenerational trauma that it was, you had to come to America and you had to assimilate. You couldn't be who you were. You could not share that. You could not explain that. You kept your head down and you just couldn't be that. And you assimilated 100%. And then we had a lost generation, right? Because those who came and assimilated, then they lost that culture, they lost that identity, and that's where that disconnect is. That's where that, and then you lose that lack of resources in schools, and so you are not making these connections. You know, you're not making these connections about the boarding schools and runaway slaves being caught in that same sense. You know, you're not making those connections, and so that is the healing that needs to happen. The healing that needs to happen to say that, you know, your struggle is my struggle and here we are together. Not saying that we're going to put a blanket over it and just call it struggle, because that's dangerous too. We cannot do that. But to rather say, this was your struggle, this is my struggle, let's work together, let's build, let's communicate, let's collaborate. Solidarity, right? That's what true solidarity is. Not the blanket, not the, you know, everybody's, you know, we're all going to hold hands and sing, you know. But I think that's, from my Indigenous perspective, that we have to go deep. We have to heal. We have to heal these wounds, because in that time, what's happening is we're trying to one up. We're trying to claim different experiences, different expressions, different ways, and all of those things. But really, it's all based in that trauma. It's all based in that settler, colonial, imperialistic trauma that we have, right? And we've all faced it in different ways. We've all faced it in our own ways, but we can all move together and take it on, you know? And so that's like where I kind of try to go deeper, the educate, everything that everybody spoke on, absolutely. But then I go into, how do we heal? How do we heal, and how do we move forward together? And I absolutely agree, Tristan, that it is the youth. The youth are doing a fabulous job. But here's the thing, I also say that you all, believe it or not, have a heavier responsibility, because you are still young, but you are leading the way for the 7, 6, and 5-year-olds, you know, because that's, you know, again, from the Indigenous perspective, we're doing this for the 7 generations behind us. We want to leave that for them. We want to leave that healing, that good way, the no walls, no borders. We want that for them. And that's what we're moving forward into.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for those answers. Those were really important, and I especially appreciate like you guys like kind of talking about how like the modern immigrants' rights movements can be like really counterproductive and not fully like taking in the full narrative of what immigration is. And I guess segue into our next question is, what can people do to stand up for migrants of all backgrounds and identities? And I think Catherine wanted to speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to kind of reiterate, it's that, you know, it's getting to these discussions. You know, we're like when we gathered here and said, I'm happy to be in this space, I truly am, because this is where I learn the most. I learn the most in my classroom when I am with younger people and learning from them. I learn from people based on their experiences. And so some folks want to go the performative avenue, right? They want to go to a big rally, they want to hold up a sign, and they want to wear a hat or a t-shirt or whatever. And by all means, yes, that is a sense of support. But if you want to support, and this isn't just for migrants, this isn't just for, if you want to support anybody in your life, the first thing you do is you sit down and you listen to them. You hear their story, right? And so that's where coming to the table. An elder, a beautiful Tongva elder once told me, she said, if I'm not invited to the table, it means I'm on the menu, right? And so that's what we have to do. We have to come to the table. We have to come to the table, and it's not going to be all joyous. It's not going to be, you know, a good time. There is going to be discomfort. But we have been marinating in discomfort for 500 plus years, right? And we got to a point where we saw that transition 4 years ago, where we went out screaming like anybody would, right? It's the boiling point. And believe it or not, a lot of us got tired. We got burnt out. I know 2 years in, I had to take a break, you know? And now I think we're at a point where we're ready to have those tough conversations. And that is the best way to support, is to sit down and to be present, to listen, to have that tough conversation, and to figure out how do we move forward, right? And it doesn't mean it's going to be solved in, you know, that sitting. It takes work. Organizing is work. You know, performative activism, cute for Instagram. The folks who do the work, the ones who are making spreadsheets, the ones who are making phone calls, that's community building. Because here's the thing, we're not aiming for just a victory, we're aiming for liberation. And when you have liberation, well, what do you have to do next? You have to rebuild. And when you rebuild, that takes planning, right? So we don't just go for the victory, we go for what we're envisioning. And that takes work, and that takes community, and that takes sitting down and building these circles. I'm so grateful to have sat with all of you, to have heard all of you, because now I have more in my circle, right? And now I have more to build from, and now I have more resources. And so that's how I feel personally, how we can stand up and how we can move forward in this battle, and for all, right? When it comes to our environment, when it comes to women and our roles in society, when it comes to education, when it comes to all of the layers of what we are witnessing right now go down. This is how we rebuild. We listen first. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Yeah, I wanted to add, I think particularly for Zero Hour's audience, because it's young people working on the climate crisis. Like, I also wanted to address specifically how folks who consider themselves climate concerned people should be, standing up for migrants. And, I think that there's just such a siloing of all of our movements, and like, it's just so critical to understand that like all of our movements are connected to each other. And specifically, one way in which I think that climate concerned people can stand up for migrants is like talk about migration when you talk about the climate crisis. Like, there was a huge New York Times article last week, actually in the Sunday New York Times, about how like the majority of migrants, like over the next like 20 to 30 years, the majority of migrants are going to be climate migrants. Climate economic migrants who are impacted by the climate crisis. This week, 3/4 of Bangladesh, the country of Bangladesh, is underwater. Some of the largest migrations out of South Asia, where I'm from, are from climate impacted areas because of rising sea levels. And one thing to know about the US, so the US actually, there is no, anyway, all of these policies are ridiculous and like don't actually make any sense, but current asylum and refugee policy doesn't allow for someone to claim that they were impacted by the climate crisis or they were impacted by drought. That is not a basis to apply for asylum in the US right now, meaning that a lot of people on the US Mexico border, and keep in mind, like, there are Haitians on the US-Mexico border. There's indigenous folks on the US-Mexico border. I know, like, Sri Lankans who have, like, walked through, like, Central America to the US-Mexico border to ask for asylum. But if you say that you are claiming asylum because of drought, for example, that is not a basis. Also, I really think the climate movement needs to know about this really important Supreme Court case that just happened in June that has really huge implications. And actually, the plaintiff in the Supreme Court case was a Tamil migrant from Sri Lanka who was fleeing violence. And when he was detained at the U.S.-Mexico border and was told that he didn't have a case because the Department of Homeland Security officer didn't understand what the political issue was in his country of origin, my country of origin. And so that case got elevated to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has now said that any refugee or asylum seeker whose claim gets denied, they cannot contest that claim in a court. Meaning that this gives Department of Homeland Security and Immigration Customs Enforcement even more authority to just deny like anything that they want. And so this like actually goes back to the question of abolition, right? Like, what about any of these systems and policies are serving us? And so I think that when the climate movement thinks about things like, for example, the Green New Deal, think about like, how do you make a Green New Deal that actually supports everyone? Like, how is the Green New Deal going to support immigrants without status? How do you ensure that the Green New Deal is in tandem with like, a more radical immigrant rights movement that's talking not just about reform, but actually policies that are going to help people? How do you ensure that asylum actually is expanded beyond the current, like what it is currently? And another fact, even though like, with Republicans and Trump and whatnot, there's like all of this like climate denial, like even the Pentagon, for example, the Pentagon actually like very much understands the quote unquote threat of the climate crisis. But to the Pentagon, the threat of the climate crisis is more Black and brown people coming into the United States. That is the same threat that Europe is facing. When you think about things like the Muslim ban, and particularly about Syrian immigrants who were fleeing, a lot of the Syrian refugee crisis actually is because of a climate crisis. It was a crisis that was created because of drought and because of farmers moving to cities, and that caused this crisis within Syria. And so a lot of places, like, it's like like migration is always a complex thing. It's not like people are migrating just because of one thing. But climate is a reason why a lot of people are migrating from all around the world. It's a compound, complex set of crises, whether it's like corruption or violence or poverty. And it's also the climate crisis. And so I think it's really important for climate people to be really talking about the climate change from an intersectional way, because the way I approach climate is from um, the perspective of the climate crisis being an umbrella that actually it has to incorporate all of our movements, and that's the only way we can move forward. Because I'm really not interested in talking to white climate bros about windmills and solar panels. Like the climate crisis and what we need to do around climate change is way bigger than that. And that's why, like, even 350.org, like, we were one of the first climate orgs to say defund the police, and everyone was like, oh my god, why are they saying that? Because it's like, actually we're talking about abolishing complete systems, because the only way to deal with, like, the crisis of the climate is a crisis of capitalism, and the only way actually to deal with the fossil fuel industry and the climate crisis is to actually get to the root of the issue, and that actually requires dismantling entire systems.
Yeah, I really resonate with like what both of you guys said, and just like all these incredible people. Like I can't even imagine having a teacher like Catherine who's actually like teaching like Indigenous people's history, and just like I know I live in Virginia, and like we were taught like from the Confederate side, like we were taught mainly about like Confederate victories during the Civil War. Like you didn't learn about Union victories, and just like how like history is just like not taught in the right way, and like it's just so crazy to me that there are people out there like you, Catherine, who are like actually preaching like what is real, like, and that's just so crazy and cool and awesome, and I'm really excited to talk to everyone here. If anyone else has any final comments or wants to respond to the question about what we can do to support migrants, please feel free to go.
Um, I guess just from, I guess, an activist and community member kind of perspective, um, if you are privileged enough, to be working from home, or to have parents who still support you, or, to just not be, yeah, in a position where you have to, be working right now during a pandemic, get involved with your community. Look into what mutual aid efforts are going on in your community, particularly around the undocumented communities. Like Alan mentioned earlier, like orgs like Undocu Black have been really leading. And what's his name, Jonathan? I saw him speak a while ago. And I think that, yeah, like getting involved, and I think like you don't have to have all the answers, but you have to come with the mindset of, being willing to try things on, and acknowledging, yeah, like the education that you have had, and like the perspective that you've been given, and be able to unlearn a lot of the things that you may realize were never, you know were intentionally kind of like taught to you, but may not actually, pertain to your community or your life or the way that you want to live, I guess. Um, so I guess I work with a lot of young people, and so I'm just kind of using the language, I guess, that I use with people. But yeah, get involved, and don't be don't don't be afraid of not knowing, but but also be respectful of people, right? Like people aren't there to just educate you. People are going through a lot, and it takes a lot of emotional labor. And for me, for example, on the DACA decision day, I had a whole bunch of people like calling me for interviews, and they were asking me, very like personal questions, and I didn't answer those questions. I answered how I wanted to answer. And so don't ever ask questions thinking you're going to get the answer that you want, right? Be willing to take a step back, and like everyone like mentioned, like listen. Like listening and hearing others is like the first step, especially if you are a person of privilege.
One thing that I might add would be to also, if you know any Indigenous or immigrant people in your community, figure out how you can support them. I feel like Google is free. There's so many resources to educate yourself without asking people you know in a way that's overwhelming for them. And also, it's just, I feel like social media is such a great way to connect. Nowadays, I have found it to be a really amazing resource where I've been able to reach out to different people. So take some time, set aside like maybe 10 minutes or 20 minutes a week to really do some social justice work and actually put your actions behind your words. I think performative activism is a huge issue. And if you really claim to care about these issues, then set some real time aside and do some real work that supports the people who need the most help right now.
And I guess I'll just say very briefly, as far as the audience for Zero Hour goes, to kind of echoing what Tanu has says, to really be conscious of how we are moving in spaces. And I think a lot about it in demonstrations, the ways in which people will show up for a demonstration and not have an analysis of their carbon footprint for that demonstration, the level of trash being produced, like in the demonstration, how they're treating the people, the sanitation workers after the demonstrations. And I also think about the ways in which when we gather, how gatherings are places of intimate domestic violence against queer and trans people. And in order for us to really work in climate, to get to a vision where the climate is a place where life is like livable for all of us, we have to think about the current climate against queer, trans, and Black folk, because we have been written off as people who are not worth having livable lives. And a lot of the times without us in those conversations, the future world that we are envisioning will not sustain us. And that is one thing that climate change hasn't addressed. The futures that we are imagining, how are those futures also going to sustain the longevity of trans folk, the longevity of women, the longevity of queer folk? And I just want to echo one of the cultural artists who I absolutely love. Her name is Ariana Brown. And she recently wrote a piece, and the piece ended with, if there are Black girls in the future, there won't be much else, because that is the reality. In order for Black girls to exist in the future, we have to unlearn almost everything that we know. So when we're thinking about imagination, we also have to think of, for whomst are those futures?
Can I just add one last little short thing? I think too, just hearing from all of you and this go round, is that just remembering too that it's a human issue, and when people tend to think of climate and Tanu, on point on everything, that you just think about water, you think about land, you think about the sky, you think about weather, but you forget that it is a human connection. And again, we are connected to this earth. The earth speaks and moves to us, and so we are connected. And so not just a human issue, but also our plant relatives, our animal relatives, all of that. But as we navigate through the topics and in these discussions, we are hearing human experiences and human stories. And breaking down that wall, we can be inclusive of every story, because every story is valuable, and so that's what we have to be mindful of, that we are dealing with human experiences and human stories and their witness to what has brought them here or there or everywhere in between, and so just kind of keeping that in mind. And that comes out of a reflection of what everybody shared, that this is about humanity.
Yeah, I wanted to thank everyone. I think that's a great thought to end our panel on. I want to thank everyone for your time. I know this didn't go as smoothly as we probably wanted it to, but that's okay. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their time and knowledge and wisdom and being open with everyone. So thank you. I guess we can end it here. I'll say I can stop recording. And yeah, thank you so much.